Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking about resources and capabilities, which are the internal environment of the firm, and we're trying to understand what they mean for sustainable competitive advantage and how we can use them to develop a strategy that will result in above average returns for our companies. So we are going to cover several things today. We'll talk about what resources capabilities basically are and how they affect firm strategy. We'll talk about how they affect competitive advantage. We will try to distinguish between resources, capabilities, core competencies, and core rigidities. Those are the things that are not necessarily emphasized by the textbook, but they are essential. So I will spend a little bit of time there. We'll try to understand how we appraise the strategic importance of our resources and capabilities and how we use them to establish, sustain, and appropriate competitive advantage. And then finally, we'll try to bring it all together by discussing how you make sense of resources and capabilities, which one you want to try to invest in, which ones you will try to divest for the benefit of the firm, and which ones you may actually safely ignore. So let me start with a very basic slide that tells you about the importance of resources and capabilities for strategy. You remember, right, that in strategy, we try to balance together the internal environment of the firm and the external environment. The external environment is what brings about opportunities and threats. And typically, when we look at external environment, we analyze our competition, our customers, our suppliers. So this is what the Porter's 5 forces of competition framework refers to. And this is what we covered last week. So that part definitely has some implication for strategy making. And if you remember, we said before that at most, industry environment and external environment is responsible for about 20% of your company performance. Today, we're looking at your internal environment, something that's known as resources and capabilities. There's more to the internal environment of the firm. There are also goals and values. This is something we discussed during the first week. There's also structure and systems, and we'll talk about organizational structure later on. It has to do really more with strategy implementation rather than strategy formulation. And so far, we've been looking at strategy formulation with you guys. Resources and capabilities are really the core of what constitutes the strategy. Together, they are responsible for about 30% of the firm performance. And this is the largest chunk that we are able to understand, are able to explain, because you remember about 50% of company performance is a complete noise. We don't really know where it comes from. It can be luck, it can be circumstances, any number of things. So this topic, capabilities of the firm specifically, are extremely important to devising a strategy that will see our company succeed. And I definitely encourage you to spend significant effort trying to make sense of organizational capabilities and what to do about them when you consider different strategic options. Just a quick, I guess, lyrical digression. For those of you who have come from the economics background, you probably have heard the terms Monopolarants and Ricardian rents. So Monopolarants, they have to do with basically a firm occupying a position of power, having access to some resource, maybe land or natural resources, whatever the case might be. And if you have them, right, if you're in an industry where competitive forces are such that you could enjoy monopolies, then definitely industry attractiveness is very important to you. You try to make use of those resources over which you have monopoly, and you exercise your power in this way, and this becomes the source of your above average returns that you hopefully would sustain into the future. The second source of superior returns is what we're looking at today. These are the so-called Ricardian rents. They have to do with resource yield. And this is basically about how you use your resources to develop capabilities that would enable you to earn above average returns over the long run. So again, this slide is not critical, do not panic over it. It just, if at some point you hear me or someone else talk about Ricardian rents, keep in mind that this is about competitive advantage, about your resources, capabilities, and that has to do with obviously David Ricardo, who has written an important book about that, several hundred years ago. So, what do resources and capabilities have to do with competitive advantage? So obviously the idea is if you have superior resources, right, better than what your competition has, then you can deploy them in a manner that would enable you to earn more, right? Maybe they cost less to maintain, maybe their yield is higher than what your competitors have. And this is why if you have those, if you're in agriculture and your land is extremely arable, that's definitely good for you. If you're Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, then obviously if you're interested in organic produce, there are pretty tight definitions for what constitutes an organic produce. It has to come from a land that has been maintained in a certain way over a certain time, and only about 3% of land in the US is certified organic. So having access, having some control over those resources would be absolutely essential. But in a basic sense, when we talk about resources, we distinguish between three different groups, and each of them would be important, but to a different degree. So we classify resources into tangible, intangible, and human. Human is a separate group, and we'll talk a little bit about it because it is important. The easiest one to capture would be tangible resources. So this is something that you can basically, touch and quantify very easily. And in the most basic form, it comprises your financial resources, right? So cash, securities, borrowing capacity. You cannot necessarily touch or see digital cash, but you know its exact value. And this is the most liquid resource that you can convert into anything else, right? You can definitely see that on your balance sheet. So that's the one kind of resource that is not unique, but that's absolutely essential for you to get access to whatever else may be important for a firm. The other kind of tangible resources would be your physical resources. Things like your plant, equipment, land, mineral reserves. Again, they do find their way onto the balance sheet of the company. You can see what those are. The big question is the valuation of those resources. And, for many of them, there is no adequate way to value them. But here we are not necessarily concerned with their value. We're just concerned with being able to identify the kinds of resources that you have, because you would be using those, you would be deploying those to create your competitive advantage, as we'll discuss later on. By themselves, these tangible resources, unless it is some really, unique piece of equipment or unique mineral resource deposit or something like that, they are not very likely to endow you with a sustainable competitive advantage. Sustainable competitive advantage is more likely to come from your intangible resources, things that you cannot necessarily see, smell, or touch. Things like, your technology, patents, copyrights, trade secrets, and those are definitely very important because, when you patent something, you have to disclose the idea, right? When something is copyrighted, it is in essence freely not available, but at least visible to your potential competitors. Trade secrets are the ones that you definitely hide. No one knows what they are. Think about the Coca-Cola recipe. Arguably, no one knows what it is. There's a lot of competitors, there's a lot of imitation, but no one knows the exact formula. So that would be the trade secret. There are also things like reputation. So your brands, your relationships, your history of relationship with your suppliers, customers, and whatnot. And this is something that is definitely important. Other things being equal, the prices you charge will depend to a significant extent on your reputation, right? So not so much tangible resources. Think about consultant business. If you have a reputation for excellence, then you would be able to demand above average prices, even though your costs are not necessarily higher than those of your competitors. So reputation is extremely important. Um, think about, you go to a grocery store to buy some, I don't know, soft drinks. There's Coke and there's some store brand, private brand that, is essentially a very similar product. You know for a fact that you'll be paying more for a branded product. So this brand equity, the amount that you pay for brand over and above what you'd pay for a non-branded product is definitely extremely important for firms to be able to generate above average returns. And then there's also this thing as culture, right? Organizational culture. Um, Even if you consider everything else, right? There are some companies that people are happy to work for, some companies that customers are happy to buy from just because of what it stands for and how it treats its employees, its customers, its suppliers, and sort of the environment in general. So that is also essential, but it's almost impossible to quantify, to value adequately, right? So intangible resources are extremely important in explaining why some firms and not others get sustainable competitive advantage. And then finally, there is this group of resources known as human resources, and they are kind of a funny one. You do not see them on the balance sheet, right? The organization does not own its employees, but really it's the skills and know-how embedded in those employees that allows many firms to establish competitive advantage. Right? So this is why there is such fierce competition for graduates of many MBA programs among competitors from different industries, right? Even firms you would never consider competitors because they serve different markets and operate in different industries, compete when it comes to accessing human resources. So motivation obviously is very important here because it explains the extent to which people are ready to apply themselves for the benefit of their customers and ultimately their organization. So these three groups of resources, tangible, intangible, and human, they sort of constitute the resource base of the organization. But by themselves, they do little. It is really how you combine the resources, what you can do with these resources that explains why some firms outperform others. And oftentimes you do not have to have superior resources, right? It's the way that you combine them. It's how you bring this all together that enables some firms to do better than others. My favorite example comes actually not from the business world, but from athletics, from sports. There's a movie. I actually like to illustrate a lot of strategic concepts with movies. So the movie is called Miracle on Ice. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's kind of old, and it is about the Winter Olympics. And so, back in the past, the Soviet team used to be extremely strong. The U.S. team, even though you guys had the NHL, you had star players, but as a team, you did not do so well. So that movie documents, I think, the Winter Olympics of 1980. And according to the movie, which is entirely based on historical events, a decision was made to not really involve NHL players and rather to get college players and combine them into a team and, create this organizational culture and create the team spirit and nurture it. And, of course, if you've seen the movie, it does not end so good for Russia. And I found myself in a very peculiar situation when, I was watching the movie and rooting for the American team against the Soviet team. So that was kind of funny. But the idea is, again, it's what you do with the resources, it's how you combine them together that leads to the development of capabilities. And organizational capabilities inform your strategy and endow the company with a competitive advantage. So we'll definitely talk more about that in a few minutes. One more thing about definitions. So resources is basically what the firm owns or controls. So pay attention to these controls. Oftentimes, you do not have to physically own the resource. If you have a way to control it through whatever means, it could be a strategic alliance or a joint venture or anything. If you can control the resource, you do not have to own it to use it towards the development of capabilities and ultimately towards the development of your competitive advantage. Capabilities is what the firm can do with the resources it owns or controls. So this is a higher order thing. And this one is a lot more important for the development of competitive advantage. There are different kinds of capabilities. The probably most advanced would be referred to as dynamic capability. And this is basically the capability that allows for modification, adaptation of existing capabilities, or the creation of new ones. I think of this as maybe a learning capability, when you can learn from the environment, when you can, maybe redeploy the resources that you already have and come up with an ability to do something else in addition to what you've been doing previously to address whatever changes you see in the external market. Some of those capabilities, the distinct ones that truly endow the firm with a competitive advantage, would be known as core competencies. And organizations typically have a great number of capabilities, right? So if you think about functional capabilities like manufacturing, financial stuff, customer relations, procurement, a lot of those, will be important. But as a firm, you cannot truly excel in all of those areas. There's usually 2 to 3 areas where you really excel, where you can really outperform others. So those distinct capabilities that may endow the firm with a competitive advantage are known as core competencies. And the basic advice and strategy is once you identify them, you want to maintain them, you want to keep investing in them, you want to maintain your lead in the market to make sure that you are ahead of the competition, at least in this respect, right? So that's a very good advice, but there's a danger to it as well. Sometimes if you really commit yourself to investing in a specific core competency, what happens over time as the market changes, as new competitors come in and maybe come up with a way to substitute for whatever capability or competency you have, those core competencies could become core rigidities, right? So you may set your firm on a path from which it cannot really deviate much. And so you would keep investing in competencies that no longer matter. Think about, 100 years ago or so, You guys have just recently done the Tesla case. Think about the steam engines, which back then were, extremely important in, well, maybe a bit over 100 years. In sort of as the primary, as a de facto standard for engines that the cars would run on. If your company was really well developed and had all the competencies in the area of steam engine manufacturing, at some point when the industry switched to internal combustion engines, your steam engine capability would no longer provide you with a competitive advantage, let alone sustainable competitive advantage, right? So when something like that happens, you have to think very critically about what's going on and possibly find a way to divest that capability and develop something else. Or maybe find a new application for the same capability. We'll talk about one company, Remington, has done that, well, probably about 50 years ago, and compare that story to the story of its competitor from Europe, Olivetti. There are different ways of sort of making sense of capabilities. One way is to just look at functional capabilities. And again, those would be things like, basically you think about what the company does and you describe those capabilities, again, finance, marketing, operations, whatever the case might be. That is instructive, but not terribly helpful. A better way to think about capabilities is to consider the value chain analysis. And, here you split the capabilities in two big groups, the so-called primary activities and support activities, right? So this is what the firm does. And primary activities are the ones that have to do with essentially transforming inputs into outputs and then, serving your customers. So there would be things like inbound logistics, operations, outbound logistics, marketing and sales, service, things of that nature. Support activities are the ones that do not have to do with transformation of inputs into outputs directly, but that are essential for the firm to be able to perform those primary activities. Right, so here we talk about the firm infrastructure, human resource management, technology development, procurement. And the interesting thing is I want to emphasize here technology development. We all tend to think about innovation and research and development as being such a key component of what firms do. Well, for most companies, this technology development is not a primary activity, right? It is a support activity, and that has implications for where your ideas should be coming from if you are serious about establishing sustainable competitive advantage. There's this whole movement towards open innovation where firms now start looking for innovative ideas outside of their boundaries, right? So there could be cross-licensing arrangements, again, strategic alliances, acquisitions of technology, investment in new ventures that may have potentially interesting technologies. And at the same time, firms, once they have their own technological ideas, they don't necessarily try to commercialize everything in-house. So they start divesting those ideas, licensing them out. And that is a new normal, right? So previously firms were focusing a lot on trying to protect the technological development and just, stay true to what they do in-house. With this understanding on value chain analysis and primary and support activities, firms have realized that, in essence, ideas could come from anywhere. And, that is changing the way that businesses operate. So again, if you have more time, try to Google open innovation and see how firms are repositioning themselves to take advantage of the opportunities freely available across many markets and many industries, without locking themselves into this path dependency that was previously sort of the norm for many companies. Not every capability is equally important. So when you try to assess the strategic importance of different capabilities, there are three things that you look at. Whether or not they can establish a competitive advantage, whether or not that advantage can be sustained, and whether or not you can appropriate that sustainable competitive advantage. It's no secret that, in some markets, even if you come up with great products and no one can sort of compete with you for customers, the rules of the games are such that you would not be able to appropriate a significant chunk of the value that you produce. So as you sort through your capabilities, you have to think of that other aspect as well. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So first of all, when you look at establishing competitive advantage, for capabilities to be a source of competitive advantage, two things are absolutely essential. That capability has to be valuable, right? So your textbook refers to it as relevance. So it has to create values for customers. If no one wants to pay for what it is that you can offer, then there's very little sense investing in that capability or maintaining that capability to begin with. It also has to be scarce, right? And some other sources refer to this as rareness. The idea is there has to be then, because of supply and demand, the prices that it commands will drop basically to the point where you earn zero profits, or maybe to the point where you incur some losses. So it has to be rare enough. What is rare? There's actually some guidance from research. You don't have to be the only firm that has that, or just one of the few firms, but the number of firms that have this capability or that have access to this specific resource has to be lower than what is needed to establish perfect competition. Again, if you guys have taken economics, you remember, right? Perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. So as long as you have at least a monopolistic competition, then that is your key to getting competitive advantage. If you don't have resource scarcity, if the resource is not rare, the best you can hope for is competitive parity and not competitive advantage, right? So that is very essential. So again, for a resource or capability to endow the firm with a competitive advantage, it has to be valuable or relevant, and it has to be rare or scarce. The bigger issue, perhaps, is sustaining competitive advantage, right? So once you've developed this advantage and once you get above average returns, what's the likelihood that you will be able to continue doing so into the future? There are several things that come into play here. First of all, it has to be durable, right? If I think about technology and innovation, and you hear it all the time that innovation is key to success, and firms are, they really invest in innovation, and they try to be the leaders and whatnot, and come up with new technologies, new products, new services. Technological life cycle right now is actually very short. So even if you come up with a great technology, a few years down the road, someone will have a better idea. So technology itself, because of shortened technological life cycle, is not likely to be a source of very durable competitive advantage. On the other hand, if you think about things like brands, they're not rooted in a specific technology, they kind of have the life of their own. Right? So think about, Disney. Right? The brand is very strong, And I don't know if you guys have kids. So when my daughter was little, she was a big fan of Disney, and of course, there's those Disney stores with all those dolls that you have to pay $100 to get. And to me, like, it doesn't really make any difference with $20 dolls, but to her it was a big deal, right? So we had to do that, and that's the power of brand. If you have a powerful brand, it is very likely that it will be durable, so it will help you sustain your competitive advantage into the future. The other thing that is important is so-called transferability, or sort of the flip side, non-tradability. The idea here is if that key resource that is required for your success or key capability can be easily acquired, it is not very likely to be a source of sustainable competitive advantage, right? So you got it, someone else can get it. If many firms can get it, they will flood this industry. And again, because of the supply and demand and competitive rivalry, above average returns will go back to average pretty soon. So you may have a temporary competitive advantage, but you will not be able to sustain it. The thing here is that oftentimes you do not really know which of the resources is absolutely essential for competitive advantage. So you see what other companies are doing, you try to get those same resources, but what you can get has little to do with why those companies have competitive advantage, right? And different firms have different beliefs about the value of resources. Again, if you just look at balance sheets, you're going to see that there's just some book value to the resources they have. It says very little about the competitive advantage that those resources can provide. And so, as a result, oftentimes firms end up overpaying for specific resources. They pay for them more than the value those resources would generate. So for this reason, this whole idea of being able to buy the resource that would lead to competitive advantage, it's either incorrect in the assumptions, or if the assumptions are correct and the resource is priced adequately, if it's easy to get, it will go away over time quite fast because everybody else can get access to that same resource. The third thing is replicability. And again, the flip side is non-imitability. The idea here is that if the resource or capability may be easily imitated, it is unlikely to result in a sustainable competitive advantage. So what if you have some unique resource and no one can get access to it, if it can be replicated or imitated by someone else, right? It does little to extend your competitive advantage over time. And finally, non-substitutability. So if the resource can be substituted as opposed to imitated, then again, it is not very likely to result in a sustainable competitive advantage. So once you have the resources that are valuable and rare, you have competitive advantage. Once you have the resources, if those same resources are also durable, non-tradable, non-imitable, and non-substitutable, then your competitive advantage will be sustained, right? So no one will be able to take it away from you. But even that is not all, right? You have to be able to appropriate at least a substantial share of this competitive advantage, right? That value that you create for customers and that no one else, none of your competitors can create with that same ease or same effectiveness, you have to be able to appropriate a big chunk of it for your company to really enjoy above average returns. And there are several things that contribute to the appropriability of your competitive advantage. Some of them have to do with the industry you're in, right? So think about property rights. Some industries offer very strong support. If you have a patent, you protect it. Think about pharmaceutical industry. Sure, it takes billions of dollars and many years to develop effective drugs and obtain FDA approval for it, right? Multiple steps, and like I understand. Think about the COVID-19 vaccine. The research has been going for quite some time, and some countries have claimed that they have developed the vaccine. Here in the US, where we have the most developed pharmaceutical companies, um, they have not completed the process because of very stringent requirement imposed by the FDA. And so, as a reward for those firms, the patents are extremely strong in those industries. So once you've invested the resources and developed a specific drug, you can exploit it for many, many years, right? And charge basically whatever you want. This pharmaceutical market in general is the one that is known for exorbitant rates of returns. On some drugs, there's a research that they've seen, the profit margins are many times over illegal crack cocaine markets. And this is all protected by the, patent regime and whatnot. So, there's a reason for why some industries are like that. If you happen to be there, if your resources and capabilities are protected by these property rights, then you can definitely appropriate a major chunk of value that you create through deploying these resources and capabilities. Relative bargaining power, again, something that's rooted in how industry forces have aligned. If you have a lot of bargaining power over your customers, then you get to keep a lot more of the value that you create. And then finally, embeddedness, right? So this is primarily true for the advantage that has to do with your human resources. There are some routines that are embedded within the organization, right? And each individual cannot really claim that it is his or her contribution that results in this, competitive advantage and above average returns. If it's very hard to decouple the advantage from the individuals that work for the organization, then the company gets to keep most of it. If you happen to be in a different kind of organization where it is very easy for individuals to attribute that, whatever benefits the organization enjoys to their own efforts, then that becomes an issue for negotiation. And of course, again, the bargaining power comes into play here. But in some industries, it just so happens that individual employees appropriate a big chunk of value that they create, thus depriving the shareholders from the profits that they could expect. You may wonder what the picture of Crocs is doing on the slide. These are actually not real Crocs. These are knockoff shoes that use the same design and probably the very same technology. And there are many industries where you cannot maintain any proprietary benefits and they would be competed away. So fashion industry is known for imitation. To be successful in the fashion industry with innovative products, you have to do everything extremely fast, right? So, and this is why Zara, you probably know that company, does what it does, right? So they are extremely fast from conceptualizing the product to having it on their shelves. And, for many other companies, they cannot do that. So they resort to imitating, in which case their competitive advantage is not sustainable, right? It's temporary. They have to keep imitating. So it's a very different kind of a industry life cycle and industry speed, if you will. So we'll be talking about that probably in a couple of weeks. I'll talk about that a lot more. But yeah, so this Crocs example, back when they flooded the US market, I think it was probably 2002, 2003, thereabout. Um, they were very warmly received by the customers. And I don't know if you guys remember, I think the originally pair of Crocs shoes was about maybe $30. Whereas obviously the manufacturing costs were very little. And they were primarily marketed in the US. So back then, I had a very good friend in Sweden. He's also a professor now, but back then we were doctoral students. He would come to the States with an empty suitcase. So that was back when you could carry 2 suitcases onto a plane with no extra charge. He would buy, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 pairs of Crocs. We'll bring them back to Sweden. We'll sell them there with a markup, and that will pay for his international trip because they were unavailable anywhere else. And because appropriability regime in this industry is not tight, within a couple of years, everybody else was making them. And so, now obviously you go to any store that sells footwear. That I wanted to mention is so there's this constant quest for above average returns, and it's not clear to many decision makers if they should go after a market, the customers, or after the capabilities that they have. It turns out that most successful firms seem to look at different ways of leveraging their capabilities, right? So rather than staying true to the market, they try to stay true to their capabilities. So Eastman Kodak is a well-known example, right? The company that was, well, many of us still associate with photography. Their know-how was in, certain chemical processes. They were never really invested themselves into, making cameras or anything of that nature. So when digital photography came onto the scene, rather than trying to redeploy their capabilities elsewhere, they tried to invest some sums of money into acquiring capabilities they did not have. So they tried to acquire digital camera manufacturers. They tried to hire people who understood the technology. Because they lacked that capability, because they lacked that long history of understanding the technology, that move was not very successful for them. And I believe at the end of the day, they had to file for bankruptcy. So the idea is that if you're facing a choice, going after your customers or staying true to your capabilities, staying true to your capabilities is usually a better idea. We'll talk about that a bit more in a couple more slides. So as you look at the capabilities and resources of your firm, to make sense of what they are and how they align, which ones you want to keep investing in and which ones are not necessarily important, it is good to look at strategic importance of those capabilities and the relative strength of your company with respect to those capabilities. And as many other things in management, right, I told you we like those simple 2x2s. If you look at these 2 dimensions, you have a very simple 2x2, 4 cells. So some capabilities that are of high importance to the firm, we also have relative strength, they would be identified as your key strengths, right? They are key because they are important, and they are strengths because, relatively speaking, you are better than your competitors. You may also have some key weaknesses, right? So maybe, there is a specific activity or capability that is essential, but you're just not on par with your competition. There could be superfluous strengths, so something where you're definitely better than your competitors, but it is not essential for the success of your business. And it could be any number of things, but very few of the capabilities that your firms have will create value for the customer that the customer would be willing to pay for. It does not matter how good you are at something unless it is valuable, right? Or relevant, as this textbook calls it. So if it's not essential to success in this industry, then even though you are highly proficient, better than the competition, this strength is superfluous. So don't necessarily pay much attention to it. And then finally, there are some activities that are absolutely non-essential for your success, where you also do not really have any strength. So that would be a zone of irrelevance. So the big question is, what do you do about each of those groups of capabilities? So your key strength, you want to deploy to the greatest effect. So if you think about Walt Disney and the way that it's managing its resources and capabilities, it's absolutely brilliant. They found multiple ways to reuse and redeploy those same resources, same capabilities by striking multiple deals with different channels, by releasing their classic videos on DVDs and maybe making them now available on Netflix, and now creating their own streaming service where those same basic resources that have been paid over many, many times continue generating revenue for the company. Think about Supreme, right? You probably know that brand. And that's one of those brands that can be applied to almost anything, right? So I have here an Oreo cookie with Supreme logo on it. I'm pretty sure it's fake. I would be very surprised if it's real. But, like you have a beanie hat with a Supreme logo, and all of a sudden it's $100 hat, right? You have a, I don't know, like any kind of product, a t-shirt or shoes, and they would be commanding the price of 10 times what a competing product would command. So if you have a resource or a capability that you can deploy in multiple ways, then you definitely should be doing that. And so back to the example that I mentioned in the beginning of the session, Remington and Olivetti. So those two companies, you've probably heard of Remington. You probably have not heard of Olivetti necessarily. Back in the 1960s, they were like world leaders in typewriters, electric typewriters. And, the future seemed perfect and predictable to them until the advent of personal computers and printers. Right? And all of a sudden, nobody really wanted to buy typewriters. So it hasn't happened overnight. There was some period of time when the shift was occurring. And Olivetti, so this Italian company, has tried to do what Eastman Kodak has done. They try to go after the same customers. So they realized that, okay, people are going to use word processors, they're going to use printers, to come up with documents and print them out. So they started investing in those same areas without much success because their capabilities were elsewhere. As a result, the company still exists, but it's nowhere near its past, prime. So it's sort of a sad story. Remington, on the other hand, has looked at its capabilities instead. They realized that the same capabilities they've developed by working on electric typewriters could be redeployed to manufacture like personal care products, like electric shavers or razors, whatever you call them, and whatnot. So they switched to a completely different class of products where they could deploy the same capabilities that they had. They kept investing in those same capabilities, they kept the know-how, As a result, yes, they operate in a different industry, but they are a lot more successful than Olivetti. So that strategic decision, attention to strength, to the capabilities and resources, is essential for your long-term success. Key weaknesses, right? Those capabilities that are absolutely essential for your business, but where you do not really have any strength. Obviously, it is tempting to try to develop this capability or maybe acquire a company that has that capability. So we will be talking about mergers and acquisitions and diversification later on this semester, but those are real hard to make work, right? So a lot of companies that try to acquire a third party with certain capabilities, a lot of them fail at integrating those capabilities into their own business. A possibly far better strategy would be to outsource those capabilities to third parties, right? So rather than trying to develop the capabilities or acquire the capabilities, start sourcing those components manufactured with the use of the capability from someone else. Again, looking at the Tesla case, which we analyzed last week, there's a reason for why Daimler started sourcing the battery technology and the drive from Tesla. They did not want to develop this capability from scratch. They realized it would take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and again, as they say in economics, the nature of innovation is ill-defined. You can invest a lot of resources and really get nothing at the end. So you want to outsource those key weaknesses, right? If you do not have a strength in a particular area and it's really important to you, then find a third-party supplier and form a mutually beneficial relationship. For those superfluous strengths, so areas where you are better than the competition, but that are truly not important to your company, to the success in your industry, again, think about industry key success factors. If it does not help you succeed, then the best possible way to deal with it is to actually divest it, right? Find someone to whom this strength would be more important than to you. Again, of course, here we talk about the adverse selection and, the way that different people value that same resource or same capability, but you want to try to more value than this to you on this capability. You try to sell it off just so it does not really drain your resources going forward. And it will also generate some income for you immediately that you can redeploy towards further development, further improvement in areas which you can. And then finally, areas of inconsequential weaknesses, that zone of irrelevance that we talked about before. So those you either divest, just trying to get, at least something for those resources, or you simply ignore, right? You cannot really be super efficient everywhere. So yeah, for some of those, just let them be if you cannot sell them. And bringing this all together, the way you think systematically about resources and capabilities, well, first of all, you try to identify them, right? You identify your resources. You try to see which of those, you can combine towards something meaningful. And the capabilities that you have to combine those resources, right? Those ones would probably, some of them will be where your core competencies are. Those would be most likely to provide you with the potential for sustainable competitive advantage. So to determine which ones are these, you try to appraise those capabilities in terms of strategic importance and relative strength. And from that, you go to the development of strategy, right? So, and this development of strategy has several implications. You have to tell how strength will be exploited most effectively, which basically means, the ways to deploy your core competencies across as many different applications as possible. And in relation to weaknesses, which activities can be outsourced, can a strategy be selected that minimizes the impact of weaknesses? And, if none of that works, then okay, in those areas of weaknesses, can you strengthen them by additional investment, right? So here we talk about things like maybe acquisition of specific resources or maybe acquisition of companies that have superior capabilities. That is a very problematic proposition, and we'll talk a lot more about that later on this semester. So that is basically it. This is what the whole discussion of resources and capabilities is really all about when it comes to strategy development. Again, I would appreciate your feedback. Feel free to contact me if you need some explanation of some of these concepts. Otherwise, I will be posting my questions for the case discussion very shortly, and hope we'll see some good ideas exchange over there.